Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel. Thank you for joining me today as we continue our explorations to restore the world. Today's exploration takes us back to the U.S. Civil War, Clues to a Reset, exploring the film and book, 1861 to 1865. The documentary film The Civil War, released in 1990 by Ken Burns. Ken Burns is an American documentary filmmaker, and it had been a passion project of his to bring the Civil War to the big screen. He achieved this by pitching the idea to public broadcasting services and having the film released in 1990. The intention of today's exploration is to explore both the film and then the subsequent illustrated book that Ken Burns did to look at different perceptions of the Civil War. It's safe to say that the enduring perceptions that the United States has of the Civil War go back to this film. And it's interesting to explore and ask some questions about it because you can look in the previous decades and see how the perceptions seem to go back and forth, and even after this film, how the perceptions of the way Americans regard the Civil War continuously change. And yet it seems like it's an event that we are constantly tied to, and we're never going to let go, no matter how many years pass. Well, let's look about the Civil War, the miniseries. The Civil War is a 1990 American television documentary miniseries created by Ken Burns about the American Civil War. It was first broadcast to air on public broadcasting service for 5 consecutive nights from September 23rd to 27, 1990, and I did view it when it came out. More than 39 viewers tuned in to at least one episode, and viewership averaged more than 14 million viewers each evening, making it the most watched program ever to air on PBS. It was awarded more than 40 major television and film honors. A companion book to the documentary was released shortly after the series aired. Its filmography was groundbreaking for the time and spawned film techniques such as the Ken Burns effect. Its theme song, Ashokan Farewell, is widely acclaimed, and we'll look into that in a moment. The series was extremely influential, that's putting it lightly, and serves as the main source of knowledge about the Civil War to many Americans. Indeed, it is their only source of perception about the Civil War. However, some historians have criticized its historical accuracy, especially its lack of coverage of slavery as a cause of the war, which is intriguing because if you look at one of the historians that they interviewed exclusively, Shelby Foote, he stated that he believed that the miniseries gave a little too much credence to slavery as a cause of the Civil War. Very fascinating. So again, you already see that back and forth towards the perception of it, and when it was made and what different people think. Of course, everyone will say, well, Shelby Foote was a Southern historian, so naturally that's going to be his point of view. It's a fair observation to make. The series was rebroadcast in June 1994 as a lead-up to baseball, then remastered for its 12th anniversary in 2002, although it remained in standard definition resolution. To commemorate the film's 25th anniversary and the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination, the film underwent a complete digital restoration to high-definition format in 2015. Matthew Brady's photographs inspired Burns to make The Civil War, which in 9 episodes totaling more than 10 hours, yes, it's quite a slog, explores the war's military, social, and political facets through some 16,000 contemporary photographs and paintings and excerpts from letters and journals of persons famous and obscure. The series' slow zooming and panning across still images was later termed the Ken Burns effect. Burns combined these images with modern cinematography, music, narration by David McCullough, anecdotes and insights from authors such as Shelby Foote, who we mentioned before, historians Barbara J. Fields, Ed Bears, and Stephen B. Oates, and actors reading contemporary quotes, from historical figures such as Abraham Lincoln, Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, Walt Whitman, Stonewall Jackson, and Frederick Douglass, as well as diaries by Mary Chestnut, Samuel Watkins, Elijah Hunt Rhodes, he comes up a lot in that series, and George Templeton Strong, and commentary from James W. Symington. A large cast of actors voiced correspondence, memoirs, news articles, and stood in for historical figures from the Civil War. Burns also interviewed Daisy Turner, then a 104-year-old daughter of an ex-slave whose poetry features prominently in the series. Turner died in February 1988, a full 2.5 years before the series aired. So very interesting. This was made in 1990, and Daisy Turner is the closest we get to an exact link or someone who was actually there, and she was separated by a full generation. And that is indeed one of the challenges that you have when you make a film in the 1980s about something that occurred well over a century ago. Now let's look at this, the Ashokan Farewell. The Ashokan Farewell is a piece of music composed by the American folk musician Jay Unger in 1982. The tune was used as the title theme of the 1990 PBS television miniseries The Civil War. Despite its late date of composition, it was included in the 1991 compilation album Songs of the Civil War. And you may have heard the Ashokan Farewell. It goes something like this. Used in the Civil War documentary series. In 1984, filmmaker Ken Burns heard Ashokan Farewell and was moved by it. It is a very good song. He used it in two of his documentary films, Huey Long and The Civil War, which features the original recording by Fiddle Fever in the beginning of the film. The Civil War drew the greatest attention to the piece. It is played 25 times throughout the 11-hour series. Basically, anytime something very dramatic happens, such as including during the emotional reading of Sullivan Ballew's letter to his wife in the first episode. In fact, that's how the first episode ends, is with the emotional reading of Sullivan Ballew's letter to his wife. Why do I bring this up? Why am I highlighting the Ashokan Farewell? This was a song that was composed in 1982, and yet to most people, they perceive that song as something that's contemporary from the Civil War. That was a song that was composed during the Civil War, and there is the reason why it's played repeatedly throughout the series, 25 times. It is an emotional piece of music, and it does underscore the series brilliantly, but it also shows how we can change perceptions and even develop a new perception in terms of something that was composed in 1982 and have it imposed in an event that occurred from 1861 to 1865. And I'm not saying that Ken Burns did that intentionally or he was trying to achieve anything with malintent. I'm simply stating that look at how that affected perception and how that can change what people view in terms of being contemporary for a historical event. This is why it is very difficult to determine what really happened in history. Because even if you have someone who studies something and they have good intentions and they're very passionate about it, as Ken Burns clearly is passionate about the Civil War, they're still going to impose their own personal touches on it. And that can change the greater perception, especially when you have a medium such as film that reaches so many different people. Just something to be aware of as we go forward. Pictured here on the left is Sullivan Ballew. He was a major from the Rhode Island militia and died in the first major battle of the Civil War, the Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas Junction, as the South called it. And that's another interesting thing about the Civil War. Just about every major battle has two names. The Union gave it a name, and then the Confederacy gave it a name. Sullivan Ballew wrote a very emotional letter to his wife that was not mailed, and despite the fact that he was an officer and apparently in legal practice in Rhode Island, we don't have a picture of him. We just have a lithograph, a drawing. The individual on the right is Elijah Hunt Rhodes. He started as a soldier, again from the Rhode Island, and you hear his voice a lot if you watch Ken Burns' Civil War, because I think any time there's a major battle or whatever else, they reference his diary and you hear his voice, and basically he becomes a main character through the series, even though he starts as a soldier and works his way up through the ranks as it progresses. Just to show you two individuals, we do have a picture of Elijah Hunt Rhodes and just a lithograph of Sullivan Ballew on the left. And this is what the series gives you for your battles. Wonderful maps with great graphics, blue representing the Union, red representing the Confederacy, and these are how every battle look. And then they put in the sound effects, the cannons going off, the musket rifle fire, the volley fire, and they throw in the rebel yell, and then they have the good composed music, although mostly it's just the sound effects. But this is how they depict battles all through the Civil War. It's just something important to note. No, not expecting them to have video footage. They didn't have video cameras back then, but they did have cameras, and that's always a touching point, is that we don't have any good imagery or any photographs of major battles. Was it possible? Was it because nobody wanted to take the risk? What kind of photographs do we have? Well, that's something else we're going to be taking a look at as we move forward. This is a scene from the movie Gettysburg. This came out in 1993. This was heavily inspired by Ken Burns' The Civil War, and in fact, Ken Burns even has a small role as an extra. He's General Hancock's aide who tells the general he has to get down during the major charge of Pickett during the third day of the battle. This is from the end of that disastrous charge, and Gettysburg is widely regarded as the turning point of the war, and it was when everything started going downhill for the Confederacy. This powerful scene right here, portrayed brilliantly by Richard Jordan in the role of General Armistead, a Confederate general who attempted to lead the unsuccessful infantry assault on the Union lines in the third day of Gettysburg. And here he's just been shot, and Union officers are attending to him, and he wants to speak to his old friend General Hancock, who's the Union 2nd Corps commander. And he finds out from a Union officer that General Hancock has been struck down, and during this emotional scene, as he's dying, he's trying to convey the fact that he is sorry for what happened to General Hancock. And there's a lot of debate as to what he was actually saying he was sorry for, although if you look at the scene straight, it just seems as though he's simply sorry for the fact that they have to be fighting for each other. These are two individuals on opposite sides in a brutal war who are still showing humanity towards each other, and to me this is considered the defining scene of Gettysburg. This is also different because this goes back to the brother fighting brother, yet brother still appreciating brother mentality that comes out of the Civil War. Well, that perception was playing high in the early 90s, but then we had another film that came out later at the end of the 90s. Well, actually, it came out in, memory serves, 2002, 2003, Gods and Generals. And instead of featuring one battle, this featured a series of battles. This basically featured the first 2, almost 3 years of the Civil War. And you get a completely different depiction in this movie, and a lot of people considered it Confederate propaganda, as though the pendulum swang back the other way. You have really strange scenes where Jeff Daniels here, playing the same role that he did in the first movie as Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, is giving a bizarre talk about Caesar, we're about to die, salute you, before the disastrous Union attack in Fredericksburg. I also want to note that the overcoats that the Union soldiers are wearing appear gray in this scene. Now, I don't know if that's historical or if that was just a filmmaking choice, but this is the Union, the North. They're supposed to be wearing blue, and yet most of their soldiers are wearing gray overcoats. It's just a fascinating observation. To close the point on comparing Gettysburg and Gods and Generals, we see how perceptions change, how they go back and forth, how it goes from brother against brother, and then, well, we can't have that. We need to have a very pro-Confederate movie made because we know how everyone's going to react to that, because how else can they react to it? And that's what keeps things going in that perspective. I wanted to take a look at the Civil War, the book, because I do remember watching the original film. And I also remember, after watching the film, reading the book. Now, this is an illustrated history by Jeffrey C. Ward with Rick Burns and Ken Burns. So the director of the Civil War, the miniseries, is also a contributing author on this book. The reason this stood out to me is I remember watching the miniseries and the various effects that it had on me at the time. And then I also remember how reading the book affected me. And one of the things that stayed with me was just how different the book was to the movie. Now, you can always say, well, that's going to be different, but this is an illustrated history. And there were some very amazing differences in terms of perception and then the outlook of the Civil War. The pictorial history of the Civil War in the book seemed to contrast with the movie. And my impression at the time was that it was a much more gloomy tale of what was really going on. Yes, it's a terrible war. Over 500,000 Americans died in it. And yet, at the same time, it was some type of reset. Now, mainstream history tells us it was a reset in American society. We ended slavery in the United States, and that's what the official history says, even though it took 100 years or more to start to fully reconcile society. And there were a lot of lingering issues that have been discussed in many facets. But nevertheless, I wanted to explore this book and take a look at this time to try to get an idea of what it could have been telling us and pose some questions to you and see what you may think when you see these pictures and some of these things I'm about to point out. So here we have Federal sailors, black and white, being entertained aboard the ironclad Hunchback. This is intriguing because we see these sailors here, and of course, one of the things that's a recurring theme in American military history was that the United States military was not fully desegregated until the Korean War. Yes, there were exceptions, there were detachments, there were support units, and so forth. But here on this ironclad in the United States Navy during the Civil War, we have what's very clearly an integrated crew and fully desegregated. Fascinating photo because you see how some of the sailors look, not having shoes. Now, there could have been a duty reason for that. But it's an intriguing image, and again, it poses more questions than it answers. But this is just the start. And of course, here we have a picture of the Union River ironclad here on the top, and very interesting low water line on it. Very unique craft that we saw, steam driven, of course, at the time, paddle steamers that they had converted to ironclads in the Union's campaign to seize control of the Mississippi primarily, which apparently they were very successful with. If we go off the mainstream history of the Civil War, by 1863 they had achieved control of the Mississippi with the capture of Vicksburg, and had essentially won control of the main waterways at that time. In the lower left, we see a picture of the USS Monitor, which was a very unique craft and was designed and innovated by the Union for the Civil War to counter the Confederacy's conversion of what was formerly the USS Merrimack into its own ironclad. And just for everybody's edification, if you don't know, an ironclad were the first wooden craft boats that were covered with iron siding. And this was considered a new and radical development in naval warfare, and it completely changed the face of everything. Again, something that happened right after 1850, and yet something that was always with us at the same time. So make of it what you will, but they're interesting pictures and they're interesting craft from any era. And I remember learning about it the first time in the 1990s, and I was surprised at how advanced the technology was. And the fact that there was that kind of technology, especially this rotating turret on the USS Monitor. Now, supposedly they couldn't fire the two guns at the same time. They had to fire them in sequence. One would fire and then the other would fire. In any event, just a picture here of a Union encampment, and in the background you can kind of see some towers and some buildings if this is near Washington, D.C., which I presume it is based on the picture caption. Fascinating positioning of where this cannon is, and then you see what appears to be a built-up wall or fortification, but who knows exactly how old this is. Is this supposed to be sandbagging? Is this dirt? Is this something else? Not exactly sure. But it's an interesting photo to show us some of the positioning of the armies. And okay, yes, there were soldiers, and I don't know where they're pointing this cannon towards. It's fascinating. Before they went off to war, soldiers often had themselves photographed alongside the wife or sweetheart they had to leave behind. Very interesting, because the impression that we have is that the availability of photography was limited at that time. But it looks like we've got a Union soldier here on the left with his wife, and then I think this is a Confederate soldier on the right with his wife as well. But fascinating that they would go to those lengths, and we know photography was still new, and I can understand why we'd have lithographs or paintings, but it seems as though photography was widely available, and that's the impression that these kind of pictures give us. And again, here's another interesting one. Of course, we have mention here in the text of Sullivan Blue being killed, although we don't have a picture of him, we just have a lithograph. The names of the soon-to-be separated couples on these pages are unknown. So, interesting pictures, well-equipped and well-decked out in their uniforms, and looks like their respective wives are wearing their very best dress for the pictures. Interesting that he's holding a musket. Fascinating imagery, and yet at the same time, it continues to tell the story that there was widespread availability of photographs, that anybody could get a photograph. Just something to be aware of. I like this picture, and the reason being is that we have several images of very large buildings. I mean, it almost looks like you have modern garages here, although we can see train tracks pulling into them. And we see a lot of activity here. Interesting building here with a lot of detail in it. Look at that. All those fine little arches there above amazing windows, and then just a tower. And then, of course, you got some more towers over here. Possibly a church, or it could be something else. Very well built out block here. Amazing buildings, a lot of detail in them. And something else to note in the photo, we can actually see a large formation of soldiers moving here and a lot of equipment and wagons, and the photo easily captures it. So we don't see blurs or anything like that. This is very intriguing here in the foreground. Yeah, it's very well-developed telegraph pole, perhaps. It's interesting how many times you see that. And I also like all the railing here on the side of this very, very well developed bridge. Quite remarkable. Interesting photo. And then, of course, we have our favorite person from Ken Burns' The Civil War, Elijah Hunt Rhodes. I think he does half of the narration in the film. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you do hear a lot from Elijah Hunt Rhodes. It's interesting. The Sumter Light Guards, Company K of the 4th Regiment of the Georgia Volunteers. So, alluding to this being at Fort Sumter potentially, and of course we see the early version of the Confederate flag. What I find interesting about this photo, in addition to the trudged up ground, which could be for many different reasons, is just how well equipped all of these soldiers are. We're always told that the Confederacy had a struggle with uniforms, that they often couldn't fully equip their soldiers. A lot of times they were supposedly marching barefoot. And of course, who knows what the ground truth was, but this photograph seems to convey a very well-equipped military unit. And the building back here is very interesting and well developed as well. So many unique details in this photo that definitely pose additional questions. This equestrian statue of Andrew Jackson had already been standing for 6 years in Jackson Square at New Orleans, the city Old Hickory had saved from the British in 1815 when Benjamin Butler became military governor. But he felt compelled to order carved into its pedestal a fresh Jacksonian slogan, calculated to enrage the citizenry: "The Union must and shall be preserved." So apparently that was inscribed in there, even though the statue had been standing for a while. Very amazing building back here. And I know when John Levi did his video looking at some of the bird's eye views, he was quite amazed by what he saw with New Orleans. And this is an amazing building right here that we see in New Orleans. Look at the towers, the central spire, big huge clock in the middle. And of course, we've got all the pillars and the columns and all the mainstays that apparently were just so easy to throw up prior to 1861. It's quite remarkable. Ah, yes. Our famous Federal aeronauts, the Federal Balloon Corps. Federal troops employ two of Professor Thaddeus Lowe's horse-drawn hydrogen generators to inflate his observation balloon, the Intrepid, above left. Then, firmly tethered against errant winds, Lowe himself rises to survey enemy positions. Yeah, I gotta say, in all of our perceptions of the Civil War, how many times do we think about horse-drawn hydrogen generators to fill a balloon? Yes, we know they had to fill these balloons with something. I guess it's probably good that Mr. Lowe was well above the range of any effective Confederate fire. They were filled with hydrogen, because we know if a bullet passed through one of those, what could have potentially happened. It's very interesting because McClellan, who was the Union commander who was known for struggling with acquiring intelligence and oftentimes overestimating the strength of the Confederacy, again going from the mainstream account, even though McClellan's Union army frequently outnumbered the Confederate army 4-1 or more, he always seemed to be reluctant to take aggressive action. And yet in 1864 found himself as a presidential candidate running against the great Abraham Lincoln, according to our mainstream account. So fascinating pictures of the balloons, and that's always an interesting story to me that, yes, we had balloons and we could fly back in the 1860s. Oh, we had hydrogen generators, even if they were horse-drawn. We still had hydrogen generators. Fascinating. I'm not going to say much about this photo. We have a lot of pictures of bodies from the Civil War, and supposedly showing battlefield dead. Apparently this was a Confederate artillery crew, and we know that the bodies had to be rearranged at some point for this photo, but there's just some very interesting details that you see in these pictures. And it could just be because of the nature of how they died or how the bodies were rearranged, but I'll let you draw your own conclusions, look at it very carefully, and see what you think. It's definitely one of the recurring types of photos that you see from the Civil War, the United States Civil War, which is of battlefield dead. Ah, yes. And our depiction of General Ambrose Burnside attacking Confederate forces in the Battle of Antietam. This was called Burnside's Bridge right here. Very well-made bridge. Of course, the most important detail is that this is a painting, because this is as close as you get to actual live battlefield footage from the U.S. Civil War. It does call into mind, though, why couldn't a photographer have positioned themselves up in one of these high positions, and it wouldn't have been too difficult to get a picture of an assault on a bridge. It would have been very dramatic, but it never happened, not a single time during the war. People tell me, well, they went to trench warfare in 1864 in the Battle of Petersburg. Yes, they did. And it's funny that we don't see reenactors do that trench warfare, probably because it's not nearly as enjoyable to do as classic Napoleonic tactics. But nevertheless, that's still 4 solid years where some photographer could have parked themselves up on a ridgeline and attempted to get a battle picture, especially with all the time it would have taken these large formations to slowly march into position to exchange volley fire. Now, if the Civil War happened as we're told it happened, they definitely had a lot of courage and bravery, and that's something that's always related from it. And I certainly don't want to discredit that. And we know something horrible happened in the Civil War, and it could be exactly as we're told, but at the same time, I think it's important to examine it and ask questions. If it happened as we're told, that's great, then we need to further understand it. But I think there's too many questions to ignore. Yes, the construction of the U.S. Capitol, which continued during the Civil War. And we can see that they're building the top of the dome and the rotunda here. And on this channel, if you've watched, you've seen we've looked at several U.S. state capitals. And of course, we have the pillars here. I would just love to see one picture, just one picture where they're putting these pillars and these columns in position. It would just be so amazing to see. Even on the outside, but on the inside, of course, it's the same thing, and it's quite remarkable. You do have some cranes here. The other thing that's interesting about this photo is that you also have this interesting picket fence here. Remarkable building right here on the grounds, too. Looks very well developed, and then what appear to be some guard shacks, maybe, that are fully built out. Nice little bridge there, little walking path, and then just completely cleared out grounds. It's very interesting. Many intriguing questions from this photo. This is very disturbing because here we have pictures of many Civil War veterans and their injuries. And this is almost a grotesque and gruesome display to me. And I find it fascinating that they got these soldiers. Some of them, it looks like they're holding up their names as to who they were and where they were. And then this grotesque depiction of their injuries. And I don't know why they would do that. Now, apparently this was from the section of the book Most Hallowed Ground, 1864. Which was towards the end of the war, although they tend to depict the heavy casualties, Grant's overland campaign, and how brutal and bloody it was, and so forth. But here we're looking back, and we're just seeing human beings used as display pieces. Now, the explanation we're given is, well, photography was new then, and of course they wanted to show us how brutal and horrific war was, and what better way? We're not actually going to show battle photographs. Those are too difficult or impossible to get. But we are going to show you plenty of photographs of bodies and horrific injuries. Very interesting. It's a random building here, whether it's a courthouse or whatever. I didn't pull the caption down on this one, but again, you see the same thing with the amazing columns and this remarkable building. Even though this should have been a new building, though, it does seem to give appearances of weathering and being older. So again, more questions coming up than answers when we look carefully at these photos. And for this photograph right here, led by its regimental band, the 96th Pennsylvania marches by column of companies, the formation in which they would rush into battle. So we can get photographs of formations, and we can show camps pretty effectively. Again, you have this arid appearance to the terrain, but it could be the season, it could just be where they are, it could be the presence of the army. There's many different explanations for it. Again, it's just another one of those consistencies that I notice looking at these photos. Maybe there's a deeper story in it, maybe not, but it does come up a lot. And this photo proves that, yes, they could get a photograph of an army moving in formation. And this isn't a large formation. This looks like this is just a company-size element, 60 to 180 soldiers. It's like this picture here. U.S. Grant at left enjoys a cigar after Lookout Mountain is safely in Union hands. So later in the Civil War, after the Battle of Chickamauga and then the subsequent Battle of Chattanooga. Very fascinating, though, because you can just see Grant hanging out here. He's smoking a cigar, and that's the image with him. But you almost see a structure back here. If this is a house or what, I'm not sure. If I'm just seeing things. But again, we know that the fight didn't actually reach the top of Lookout Mountain. And I've been to Lookout Mountain, and it's a very beautiful, gorgeous view. And Tennessee is a very beautiful state, really any time of year, in my humble opinion. But again, just another interesting photograph that poses a lot of different questions. Classical columns mark the site of the Bank of Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, burned along with the business district in which it stood by Jubal Early's Confederate raiders. So we saw destruction photographs of cities in the South, especially Columbia, Charleston, and Atlanta. Everybody's well aware of that. But this is Chambersburg in Pennsylvania. And here we have the great classical columns, and it's destroyed, and supposedly this was done by a raid. And one aspect of a raid is that the Confederates were going into Union territory late in the war. And when we try to find explanations for how they achieved this kind of destruction, it's a little bit more difficult because it's not as though the Confederate Army brought large mortars with them, like we're told the Union Army did. How did they achieve this level of destruction? They just set a fire and then off it went? Maybe that's what happened. Maybe there was a large ammunition storage depot all over Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, or maybe as part of their raid, early soldiers brought all the demolition equipment they needed with them. Although when you're doing a raid, the last thing you want to be doing is carrying a lot of heavy equipment, because a raid is always a swift attack on an objective followed by a swift withdrawal before the enemy surrounds you and destroys you. Very interesting. The immense slaughter of our brave men chills and sickens us all. Gideon Wells. This is really unique because when I see this type of burial service going on, why aren't they putting the bodies all the way in the ground? I wonder if there's some mortuary reason for not doing this. I mean, it looks like they're just putting the bodies on top of the ground and then stacking dirt and grass on top of them. If anybody in the comments can give me an idea for why they may do something like this, perhaps this is just a temporary burial and then they're going to actually rebury them in the ground. But when I see something like this, and it just seems like they're not going all the way with finishing the burial. So, not really sure about this one. Maybe it's questions that I shouldn't be asking, but I'm still going to ask, especially if I don't know. Now, this is a really unique photo because in this photo, you see the classic photograph of destruction, yet the terrain in the background is pretty interesting too, because it almost looks like you have some large-scale lookout positions potentially, and the shape of the rock is remarkable. And again, we just have people all over the place here. And at last, we want to take a look at Lee's Arlington home. Lee's Arlington home is an interesting structure, and here we have a picture of Union soldiers lounge on the front steps of Lee's Arlington home. Arlington literally being right next door, actually in the confines of Washington, D.C., depending what time frame you're looking at. The famous saying was that General Robert E. Lee, the commander of Confederate armies, from his house could actually see the lights of Washington, D.C. quite easily. Obviously, didn't spend much time there as they fled shortly after the war started, and Lee's home remained under the occupation of federal soldiers throughout the duration of the war. And yes, we see some federal soldiers here. Let's get a little better look at this one. They look very relaxed, very chilled. It's almost like it's picnic time at Lee's house. Let's hang out, we got our legs crossed. I mean, yes, I understand this is potentially a secure position, but technically they are in Virginia, which is enemy territory. And again, you'd never know it looking at this photo. It looks like these soldiers are on leave, and they've been on leave for months, and they have no intention of being off leave. Look at these amazing pillars and columns. Amazing columns here on the Lee house. The construction with these windows. Remarkable building. Officers of the 8th New York State Militia at Arlington House, June 1861. So this is a state militia out of New York, and look how amazingly well equipped they are. Now, granted, that's a little easier to explain with the Union armies because supposedly the Union had these amazing factories and a vast industrial advantage over the Confederacy. But I always wondered about that, how, especially with the Confederacy, even the fact that they were able to raise, train, and equip an army in a very short amount of time and not having the industrial strength that the Union did. We're always told that for total war, and especially with mass mobilization, having industrial strength is very important. It was supposedly a decisive advantage of the United States during World War II, was its industrial strength. And yet we see photos like this. I mean, yes, these are all officers, so of course they're going to be very well dressed. But just seeing a state militia this well equipped, and like even the soldier back here looks very well equipped. Why does this photo have something strange about it? I don't know. This is what I'd expect a militia to look like, just a rabble of people wearing whatever and trying to resemble some sort of military formation, although you see younger individuals with this formation. Who exactly knows what's going on here? It's just a remarkable photo, though, from the time of the Civil War that gives you a contrasting picture of what's actually going on. Large group of people moving somewhere. Looks like they've got some horses, some wagons, but what's really going on here? Not exactly sure. Civilian volunteers patrol the lawn of the Executive Mansion in April 1861, waiting for the Northern Army to arrive. Ah, yes, very well-equipped civilian volunteers. They've got their top hats on, and Looks like they've got all their muskets with their bayonets fixed and they're ready to go. No one's getting to the executive mansion. Wonder why we stopped calling the White House the executive mansion. There's almost a little bit of interesting concepts with that title, but nevertheless, that's what they called it then. Again, very beautiful building in 1861. Of course, the executive mansion or White House, it's always been there and it's always been amazing. So we're told. This is what the Arlington House looks like today, as it's part of Arlington National Cemetery near the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Built by Lee's father-in-law, G.W.P. Custis, in 1803 to 1818. This building stands today, and it is over 200 years old. Well, at least they gave a little bit of credibility by saying it actually took them 15 years to build this with these incredible columns and this detail. I mean, who builds a house like this at any time frame? Look at these amazing chimneys on it. I mean, it just baffles the mind. I mean, could you imagine the Hiltons having amazing columns or pillars like this on any house that they built? No, I didn't think so. Stratford Hall Plantation House, built 1738. This is where Robert E. Lee, commander of the Confederate Army, was born. Amazing building, 1738. Remarkable. Chimneys and the array of bricks and the stairs, and just unbelievable that someone could build something like this in the United States in 1738 when it was still a British colony. Just remarkable. Now, I wanted to compare and contrast to close out the video because we always say that the format and what we call plantations are south of the Mason-Dixon line. Well, this is the Four Mounds Estate in Dubuque, Iowa. I'm kidding. Dubuque, Iowa. Four Mounds Estate is what was known as a gentleman's farm. Apparently there was a movement in the United States that I was unaware of until I just happened to run across this estate, which is now being operated as a bed and breakfast, as many of the older buildings seem to be across the United States in Dubuque. And it's an amazing residence, and apparently the gentleman's farm concept was a lot of wealthier people felt they needed to return to the land in the agrarian ways. So rather than just building their amazing estate out in the country, they built an entire farm. And the reason I call this to attention is that in the South, we always call it a plantation. And we have it associated with those connotations of working the land, harvesting the cotton. But in the North, we had farms, and the other story is there was no concept of laying out plantations in the North. And yet when you look at some of these so-called gentlemen's farms, where you have the large house and then the servants' quarters, which these gentlemen's farms do tend to have on them, it kind of reminds you of the layout of the plantation in the South. And then here's another example of one, 10 Chimneys in Wisconsin, which I ran across as well, and Gentleman's Farm in Wisconsin. So quite remarkable. So many different aspects and details to compare. So in conclusion, we've looked at the film, we've looked at the book, and we see there's still many great anomalies with the Civil War, whether we're looking at the people, the soldiers, the buildings, the society, the numerous accounts that were given of it. It could have just been a standard social reset and the war happened just as we're told, or there could be many more hidden facets to it. And every time we look and we try to do some analysis and ask questions, it seems to generate more questions. And so those are the conclusions that we have for now, and we'll continue to explore the U.S. Civil War and other events across the world that happened in the 1800s as they pose many questions. Ask questions, explore your existence, and you'll restore the world. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for joining me.